Advising Without Personalising, a paper by Charles Antaki on the left and Stephen Bloch on the right. Our interest here is in the kinds of dilemmas that a service which is a telephone helpline service must offer to its clients. On the one hand, a medical service will attract questions which will require sometimes medical advice. But the kinds of services that we have in mind here are those where the call taker can't provide it. And the particular example that Stephen and I were working with was Stephen's recordings with the help and support of Parkinson's UK, of the Parkinson's UK helpline, where people phone in for information and sometimes advice. But the nurse who's staffing the line, although she is a specialist nurse, is not authorised to give particular advice to people. So how does she manage that dilemma? We call the ways that she has in her armoury advising without personalising. Let's have a look at what that is. We found that the nurse could use, and did use, three kinds of ways of getting across courses of action without specifically advising this particular client. One of them was advice given as information. The second was advice which was merely contingent. And the third was advice which was in principle only. Let's have a look at each of those three. And they're all, as we say, advising without personalising, as we call it. So let's look at them one by one. Advice as information, this is a familiar thing from the work of David Silverman and Anssi Parakkila back in the early 1990s with the ways that counsellors who are advising people with HIV and AIDS to change their behaviour. And it was a sensitive thing, so they tended to give the advice as information. And we see the same thing here with the Parkinson's UK call taker. Here's what she says, for example, tremor is the hardest of the symptoms to control, in all honesty. We do find that with the Parkinson medication, it's the hardest symptoms that, is masked by the drugs. So she's giving information which is relevant to the query that the caller had for advice about what to do about tremor. But it's information, it's not advice. The second class of things that the Parkinson expert nurse did was to give advice, but only as a contingency. If something happened, then this would be the course of action. For example, here, obviously, if you're sweating profusely, it's important to make sure that you keep yourself hydrated as well. So it's an if-then. She's not making it specific and unilateral about this particular client, but it's an if-then. Should this happen, this is the course of action. And the third advice is to give advice in principle. Again, an example. I think that sometimes it's very difficult to say, and obviously it's one of those things we would suggest speaking to your doctor about, and so on. So again, she's careful not to cross the line into giving specific medical advice by giving advice in principle. Should this happen, in this case, here, one of those things we would suggest speaking to your doctor about. So she's being careful to stay within the right side of the general instruction. And this is very pervasive across lots of kinds of helplines where it's important not to presume too much and to give advice which could be misleading because you just don't have, in this case, the patient in front of you and you can't give bespoke advice. Nevertheless, you can give some advice and satisfy the client. One last thing. We saw that by doing all of this, there was an added benefit to the call taker, and that was doing advice in these general, in principle, contingent ways, limited the interactional risks of tailoring the advice to the caller. In two ways. It limits the complexity of the caller's account of what's going on in their lives. Because if you did try to give specific, particular advice, you need to go into quite a lot of detail, and that would lengthen the call and make the caller rather disappointed in the end if they didn't get the advice which you're not allowed to give. And it would reduce the extensiveness of the numbers of turns that the caller had to take and the potential difficulty in bringing the whole interaction to a close. And after all, the call taker's time is limited and there are other calls to take. So all in all, there are two main benefits of these practices. On the one hand, they keep to the caller's injunction, call taker's injunction, not to give particular advice. And secondly, they help manage the interaction or risks of the call. That's it. Thank you very much.